First, I think we have to recognize that there are 10 countries in the world that have a constitutional right to protect arms, and the United States is one of them. It's one of the 10 Bill of Rights, which are individual rights. And so therefore, every person has a constitutional right to keep and bear arms. Are some gun restrictions constitutional? Absolutely. We do prohibited people convicted of felonies, people under domestic violence, those types of things. There are time, place, and manner restrictions for certain buildings. We're in a building right now as we're recording this that would have limitations on guns. But U.S. v. Heller came out at the beginning of the century and was the first standalone Second Amendment case that had come before the court in 30 years, and determined that anything that is in common use and is within the process or that is commonly used by the public is protected under the Second Amendment.
The Supreme Court's been very clear that gun regulations are perfectly constitutional within the meaning of the Second Amendment and the rest of the Constitution. Gun violence is now the leading cause of death among children, people under 17 or 17 and under in the country. And we have a rate of gun violence that's 26 times higher than the nations of the European Union. And yet, every time we experience another gun massacre, whether it's Uvalde or the Tree of Life Synagogue or the Emmanuel Church in South Carolina or the Pulse nightclub, my Republican colleagues say there's nothing that can be done because of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment guarantees an absolute right to carry whatever firearm you want. And that was explicitly rejected by Justice Scalia in the Heller decision that my friend mentioned. And he went to great pains to say that the Second Amendment does not give you the right to carry any gun you want in any way you want, wherever you want. In fact, he specifically enumerated an illustrative group of gun regulations that are perfectly constitutional, like banning guns in schools and government buildings and town halls, like excluding dangerous weapons, like having background checks and so on. So, oftentimes when we have these conversations, my colleagues will say, Raskin wants us to repeal the Second Amendment. I don't want you to repeal the Second Amendment. I want you to read the Second Amendment. And it just says that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And that is perfectly consistent with having strong public safety regulation in order to protect the public's interest and the public's welfare.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to respond to that because my mom was a kindergarten teacher, and Heller also discussed at length what the comma means in the Second Amendment. And again, the Bill of Rights are individual rights, and they continue to move forward. And the problem with gun restrictions is they're proposed more often than not from my friends in D.C. And we know this. We know this from the pistol brace ban. The Fifth Circuit has said that it is most probably unconstitutional. The district court judge later put an injunction on that. And the point is, it's where we should concentrate on the laws we have. Straw man purchases, making sure people who are not supposed to have guns don't have guns, people who are prohibited. But the far and away what happens in D.C., particularly from places like me where I live in rural America, is the laws they put into place are going to affect legal law-abiding gun owners, and 43% of the people in prison bought their gun through some illegal means. And so we don't deal with the underlying charge, and we quite frankly don't enforce the laws we have now. D.C. is a perfect example of this as we continue to see rising rates in crime and less prosecution for gun crimes. D.C. is unique because it's federal, but a lot of the things in which Mr. Raskin was talking about restrictions in buildings, I say the building here because it's under the federal jurisdiction. But far and away, most of these laws need to be determined at the state level because that's where these cases occur. It's where 97% of criminal justice occurs, and it's also where people can make those interpretations for those.
Well, the vast majority of the American people agree about the kinds of gun restrictions that are necessary to save us from the worst levels of gun violence in the industrialized world. 95% of Americans want to see a universal violent criminal background check, which means closing the loopholes in the Brady Law today for internet sales of firearms or private gun show sales of firearms or just private sales that are taking place. And if we can close those loopholes, we can save hundreds or thousands of more lives a year. And it is perfectly constitutional if you take the majority decision in Heller seriously. And yet my friends will constantly get up and say you can't have any gun safety regulations because of the Second Amendment, and that's just wrong. So 95% of the people want a universal violent criminal background check. 2/3 of Americans want to see a ban on military-style assault weapons like the AR-15, which has become the weapon of choice of people perpetrating massacres in schools and churches and Walmarts and nightclubs all over America. We can do this. It's only because they want to do the bidding of the NRA, and the NRA is completely opposed to where the vast majority of Americans are on both protecting people's right to use guns for self-defense, for recreation, and for hunting, but also protecting the public's interest in life, welfare, and security.
So first of all, the Second Amendment was designed to have military-grade weapons. It was designed for citizens to have the same weapons their government had. Secondly, if you look at the Heller decision, the common use standard is pretty simple. It's a difference between having a rocket launcher and an AR-15. There's up to 44 million AR-15s in circulation in the United States right now, making up somewhere between 7 and 10% of the guns. If that isn't common use, I don't know what is. And I think sometimes when you talk about reasonable restrictions, one of my problems with the way these laws are written, particularly coming from a rural state, is it's abundantly clear that whoever wrote them, the idea of the outdoors as Central Park, because the restrictions and the exemptions to the restrictions that exist for rural America, whether it's farming, ranching, hunting, and fishing, simply won't work out there. And again, you're not going to stop people who are wanting to use a gun for ranching and fishing exemption. So you live in Southwest North Dakota and you're driving, you work for a farmer or rancher in Southwest North Dakota, and you're going to go check cattle that are on the south side of the little town you have because your land isn't touching each other. You drive off the farm, you have a coyote rifle in the back of the pickup. On the way, you stop for breakfast before you go and check those cattle. Under any one of the Democrats' proposals all there, you can check the cows on the farm and you can check the cows on the other land, but when you stop for breakfast to meet one of your buddies for breakfast, you've now committed a federal crime. We don't write these laws at the federal level because states are the more appropriate place to deal with this. And more importantly, they're not going to stop the gun crime that you're trying to stop.
So this is not a question that divides rural and urban Americans. In fact, the rates of violent gun deaths have gone up 60% in North Dakota itself since 2012. So this is a problem that's affecting people all over the country. We're seeing constant gun violence across the country and massacres taking place everywhere. So the real question is, why won't the Republican Party do anything about it? We both agree at this point that the Second Amendment allows reasonable gun safety regulation. So why don't we go with a universal violent criminal background check supported by almost unanimously by the American people, overwhelmingly by Republicans, Democrats, and independents? Why don't we have a ban on military-style assault weapons for people who are not in the military and people who are not in the militia? Well, the reason, as far as I can tell, is that Mr. Armstrong's colleagues within the Republican Party, like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Chip Roy, they say that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to allow the people to overthrow the government. They think that it gives you a right of violent revolution and that that's written in invisible ink somewhere in the Second Amendment. But I can point to 6 different passages in the Constitution where the Constitution gives the people the right to suppress insurrections. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 says that Congress has the right to call forth the militias of the states in order to repel foreign invasions and suppress insurrections here. So this insurrectionary idea that the meaning of the Second Amendment is to give you the right to overthrow the government is ridiculous. We don't have the only constitution on earth which somehow gives the people the right to overthrow our own government. That's not what it means. We have a right to protect our people, and that's why we need reasonable gun safety regulation.
Well, first of all, you can't ban AR-15s because it would be unconstitutional under any interpretation of the Heller standard. Secondly, I don't think anybody's talking about it, but the 10 Bill of Rights are an individual right. Why you have that right is irrelevant. It is an individual right to keep and bear arms. And more importantly, again, we have more gun laws on the books than you can possibly imagine, and they're not stopping any of this. The simple best way in where Republicans and Democrats could come together. There's lots of things we could do. We could have law enforcement agencies communicating with each other so prohibited people are noticed. If you've been convicted by a jury of your peers of a violent felony in Florida, I don't want you owning a gun in North Dakota. We recognize those reasonable restrictions. Unfortunately, we spend far too much time talking about issues, A, that aren't going to get bipartisan support, but B, that aren't going to withstand constitutional muster. And we know this because it just happened with the ATF and pistol braces. And this is not a country where people want you to buy something legally, be able to own it legally for a decade, and then have some bureaucrat and an alphabet soup agency say you have to file your papers with the federal government for something you've owned legally. Otherwise, again, you're going to be a federal felon. And the courts agree with me.
Well, well-regulated militias don't go into kindergartens and assassinate children. I thought that we had agreed at the beginning of this debate that reasonable gun safety restrictions are allowed. And the Supreme Court has never struck down background checks. In fact, it's one of the things that's identified by Justice Scalia and Heller as being permissible. We had a ban on military-style assault weapons for more than a decade, and that was never struck down by the Supreme Court. So all we get from the Republicans after gun violence and gun massacres is T&P, thoughts and prayers. That's it. And then they're off to impeaching this official or that official or whatever it is they claim to be working on that day. We need real action, and the American people know exactly what that means. We need to make sure that no firearms are being sold to people who shouldn't have them, like violent felons and people who are dangerously mentally ill, people who are a threat to themselves or others, criminal fugitives, illegal aliens to the country, and yet they won't act on it. They won't join us in passing a universal background check, and they won't act on taking weapons of war like AR-15s out of the classrooms and the churches and the mosques and the synagogues and the supermarkets and the Walmarts. They would prefer to simply do the bidding of the National Rifle Association, which is principally known today for ripping off the people who are their own contributors.